Hey, Dyer, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
In your book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, you take a look at a variety of Hollywood films, including films by Stanley Kubrick, Alfred Hitchcock, the James Bond series, among many others, and explore the secret messaging and symbology embodied in them. Why do you use the term esoteric to describe many of these films?
That's a good question. I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to title the book, so I had a bunch of different possible titles, and that one sounded to me the most mysterious. But I think it's also fitting because esoteric, of course, refers to something hidden or secret, and what I try to do in the book was kind of unveil those hidden secret aspects to film, be it the symbolism that you mentioned, or be it the realities behind screenwriters and their connections at times to the CIA or the Pentagon and espionage, and lay it all out. I tried to come at film from a lot of different levels, and so I felt like that was the most appropriate title. And I think I'd already kind of been playing around with a podcast with a similar title.
You write that Hollywood has been described as the new Babylon. What does this analogy signify? That is to say, what are the parallels between Hollywood and what is understood to have been Babylon, the ancient pagan empire?
Right. Well, if we think about the way that the book of Genesis, for example, describes the Tower of Babel and then eventually the empire of Babylon during the days of many of the prophets in the Old Testament, we have the idea of an oppressive kind of super state, right, that was deified or worshipped. One of the aspects that was central to that power structure was the mythology behind those empires. Every empire has its own mythology. And I would say that that translates into the present day. The British Empire had its mythology, and the American Empire has its mythology as well. And one of the ways in which that mythology is inculcated into the population or indoctrinated into the population is through storytelling. And of course, in our day, that is Hollywood. So many writers, as you said, have in the past, most notably Kenneth Anger with his kind of sex scandal book, Hollywood Babylon. I thought it was an appropriate image, but I wanted to expand beyond just, lurid sex tales and take it into the direction also of understanding how we're given our mythology by the Pentagon, by the CIA, and their influence. And it's not totally the CIA, obviously, the Pentagon, but it's also, people creating stories and using their creativity. But unfortunately, a lot of times the state co-opts that, the corporate state, and gives us messages that they want inserted into films as well. So it's a mix of both. And that's why Babylon is, I think, an appropriate image. And if you go to Hollywood, you'll see the old sets from, I think, what is it, D.W. Griffith's Intolerance film, which is from Babylon. It's the architecture of Babylon from film set.
Well, then how would you describe the mythology of ancient Babylon and how it relates to Hollywood?
Well, one analogy would be what the Babylonians were famous for was, of course, astrology, the Chaldeans as well. And the idea here was that we follow the stars, who are in a way representations or the pathways of the gods. And the way we would make an analogy to Hollywood is that in the 20th century, psychological warfare and social engineering developed the pretty direct parallel to the idea that the Hollywood stars could be the new trend setters that we would follow. So they're almost like a replacement for astrology in a way, like literally following the stars. And that was actually studied and designed by ad men, marketing men, a lot of whom came out of the OSS, which is, of course, the predecessor to the CIA. And so it's kind of a science. It's a technique. The Rand Corporation, the Tavistock Institute, they've all studied stuff like this. So it relates to movies, and in a way, you can have this idea of Babylon as the gate of the gods, right? The pantheon of the celestial deities and whatnot. And Hollywood kind of represents that now. It's kind of a gate to the human gods, right? Or the superstars that we view as gods who we think live this far off heavenly lifestyle in the Hollywood Hills or something, and really, this is all concocted lies.
You write that, quote, for Greece and in debased form Rome, the stage was sacred where the dramaturgical interactions of the gods were actually a form of magical invocation. Although the idea of the theater as explicitly sacred is foreign to the modernity, it was not for historic man, nor is modern man's praxis any less religious in regard to the theater. Could you explain why you begin your book with film as ritual?
Yes, I think that the sentence that you read there is attempting to do that. And so because the ancient world viewed the plays, Sophocles or even perhaps Virgil's Aeneid or something like this, they were all viewed as reenactments of the actions and life of the gods. And what that did was, at least in the primitive mind, was you were kind of representing that reality. You were bringing it out of the golden age or the times past or something, and bringing it back into reality, a kind of invocation. And even in, for example, Plato's dialogues, you can read Ion, where Socrates has a dialogue with some musicians and people from the theater. And they talk about how what they really want to do is to become possessed by the god or to become another character. And this is essentially what method acting is, if you study Stanislavski or method acting. So there is a direct parallel, whether one believes that it really is some kind of possession of an entity or just a very deep skill that one takes on another identity or lives out another character. Either way, it's something that goes back to the ancient world, and we don't know everything about how drama was conducted in the ancient world, but it was very similar to liturgy. If you think about a Catholic Mass, or if you think about an Orthodox worship service, a liturgy or something like this, the idea is that we're acting out through the worship service events that sort of transcend time and space. They bring the celestial, the heavenly, or the eternal down to the here and the now. And although most people don't think about movies in that way, or theater in that way more properly, that is bound up with the history of theater and acting.
And what is the method? How is that taught? What does it encompass?
I have one book if you're talking about Stanislavski's method, this goes by the term method acting. Many of the famous A-listers are method actors, and I'm by no means any kind of expert in this. I just know that in one of his texts, he does discuss techniques and patterns for kind of letting your conscious mind sort of drift away into your subconscious and attempting as best you can to allow the character that you're trying to portray to kind of come to the fore. So, and then he gives a whole bunch of other kinds of techniques of how to really perfect this craft. So, I'm not a super expert on Stanislavski. There's plenty of people I'm sure who went to various acting academies, but when you see somebody, for example, like Christian Bale, if you remember in The Machinist, when he took on that role, he got very, very deathly thin. Like he got sickly thin to play this role. Jeremy Irons, Robert De Niro. These are people who attempt to do method acting. They attempt to become the character, and sometimes they can have a very deleterious effect on the body itself.
I'm just thinking about A Streetcar Named Desire and what happened to the lead actress that played that role. Was it Vivian Lee?
That's right, yeah.
That affected her psychologically, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. There are several cases in the history of film or I guess theater too, but I'm more adept with film. There's several cases where people have said similar things. The famous story of Jack Nicholson telling Heath Ledger, "Beware playing the Joker; it'll mess with your psyche." And yeah, there have been cases like this, and I think it's probably real. There's something to it. It's not just Hollywood legends or whatever.
In your book, Esoteric Hollywood, the first film that you take an in-depth look at is Stanley Kubrick's last film before he died, Eyes Wide Shut. Throughout the film, you write, the viewer's eyes are wide shut to the reality of the power structure. The power base is not the average politician, wealthy doctor, or lawyer in New York, which were the roles played by Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise. What is the film saying about the real power base in society?
I think Kubrick is consistently telling us about the real power structure throughout his films. And, one can debate to what degree this might have been involved in his death or not, and to what degree, throughout his life, Kubrick had to cooperate with the power structure, like with NASA and the Air Force in making 2001. That's all fine and well. But I think that, when we see something like Eyes Wide Shut, I think it's a direct illustration of, as I said, the real power structure. So it's not politicians, it's not presidents. These are, as Dr. Carol Quigley said, frontmen. They're the people who give the masses the impression that they have a vote, that they have power, when in fact the world is actually run by far more wealthy people, oligarchs essentially. So if we consider the power structure, for example, behind the Catholic Church, it's pedophilia cases, and then how that has connected to a lot of very powerful politicians in various countries. This has been well documented by court cases and journalists for many decades now. I think that we get to see an insight, and Kubrick's given us an insight into that very point, that the real power structure is more like billionaires in the sense of, something like Blofeld from the Bond stories than it is, Donald Trump or Barack Obama. They're more so kind of front characters.
Now, you've used the phrase a cryptocracy of occult elites. Mm-hmm. So what does cryptocracy refer to?
This is a term that comes from a fairly well-known book by Walter Boert, who wrote Operation Mind Control. It was one of the early texts on the CIA's MKUltra program, right after John Marks wrote his book, CIA and the Search for the Manchurian Candidate, two books that are not conspiracy books per se, but actually do rely on, a lot of sourced evidence and whatnot. So Boert described the secret shadow government of the U.S., the cryptocracy, CIA, Skull and Bones, all those networks, as a cryptocracy because of the fact that they do essentially occult or secret or hide their methodology. Now, it doesn't mean that everything is secret. Some things are secret, some things aren't. But a lot of times this stuff is made public. So you can find, for example, Dr. Jose Delgado is one of the MKUltra doctors. His books are public. He has a public book called Physical Control of the Mind. And so, when Walter Boert wrote his book, he's saying, look, we can look at what the cryptocracy has published, and even from what's public, we can get a clear enough idea into the methodology of how the social engineers, how the think tanks, how the NGOs, how the academics, how the technocrats, how they all kind of work together to foster the same overall goals, even though they might at times have differences.
I'm speaking with author and radio and television host Jay Dyer. Today's show, Foreshadowing Ritual and Symbology in Film. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. Well, now, I'm hoping that people have seen Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. Otherwise, they wouldn't know what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. Could you sort of simplify the narrative of that film?
Sure.
Yeah.
Basically, it's the story of a couple who's having marital sexual problems. And they're upper class, elite, sort of New York socialite level. He's a doctor, a very successful doctor, and she is an artist or an art teacher, if I recall. And my thesis on the film is that they view themselves as sort of the top of the totem pole. Where else could you go? We've got it all. We're the elite in a way. But they realize that they're encountering, I guess, somewhat typical marriage type issues, and the Tom Cruise character is sort of tempted to find sexual gratification elsewhere. And this sort of leads to a chain of events, a kind of snowballing effect of him kind of wandering around outside of Meriden, the town, and encountering a series of so-called coincidences that lead him to this big estate where there is a masked ball, sort of a Renaissance style orgy going on at this elite estate. And it does, I think, have very conscious satanic and Crowleyan elements to the masked ball. It's very much a ritual. I don't think there's any question about that. And that, I think, suggests that many of the elite are into these kinds of occult practices, especially something like the followers of Crowley. So what happens is that he goes through the ritual, but he doesn't fully embrace the ritual. He's hesitant, and he is essentially kicked out and found out to be an interloper. Right? He's not welcome there. He didn't have the secret password, the Tom Cruise character, that is. And so he heads back home, and we are kind of left with the unclear impression that maybe even his wife was there, because she seems to know what he was up to. And she has a dream about this. And of course, many people who interpret the film, they debate whether or not either she had some sort of preternatural suspicion of him being there, or whether she actually was there. It really doesn't matter, because the point, I think, that Kubrick's trying to convey to us, in my view, is that the real world really does operate like this. This is the real power structure of extremely wealthy people who are far above politicians. And the rest of the film's narrative, without giving too much away, if you haven't seen it, is that the cult essentially has basically all the powers and functions of an intelligence agency. They're able to have Tom Cruise's character surveilled, followed. They know everything about him. They have moles everywhere. And they're able to even craft news stories to cover up murders that the cult is able to engage in. And this is really what some writers have called the CIA, the cult of intelligence. Right? I mean, that's who could pull all this stuff off. And as many historians of espionage have noted, the CIA is more like a private intelligence army for the Rockefellers. It was the Rockefellers and British intelligence who established the CIA. So I think Kubrick is roughly hinting at a lot of these different things. It's a kind of a overall portrayal of the power structure. And that's why he called it Eyes Wide Shut, because most people just think that the world is ruled by politicians and bureaucrats, and it's not. It's ruled by, extremely wealthy finance capitalists and corporatists.
You write that both Polanski's The Ninth Gate and Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut were filmed in Rothschild mansions. I didn't know that.
I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I don't remember the name of the estate, but I think I mentioned it either in the book or somewhere else. But yes, I think the Polanski one, it's not presently owned by Rothschilds, but it was at one time. And of course, the Rothschilds owned multiple estates in Europe throughout, the last several centuries. So it's not hard. That's not hard to believe, given the fact that they had tons of palaces. So, but yes, it's also, if I recall, the mansion that you see in Batman: The Dark Knight, the Christopher Nolan, Christian Bale Batman. That's also the Rothschild estate there, and it has a very interesting history. It's an estate that the Beatles did a lot of transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi with. So it's a very colorful history to that estate, and I think it's since been sold off. It's not owned by. I think it's like a museum. It's owned by the state or something now. It's not privately owned, I don't think.
You mentioned in your book, and I just mentioned, Polanski's The Ninth Gate. Now, not only have I not seen that movie, I wasn't even aware of it. But for the photos in your book, it looks like it's similar to Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. Is that right?
Is. I think so. I think if I recall, they both came out in 1999. They both have very similar themes. Kubrick's film is not really interested in the supernatural. Then the Polanski takes it in more of a consciously supernatural and Luciferian route. So this is another indicator, I would say, that, Polanski was telling us things about the underground networks in the U.S. back when he did Rosemary's Baby. And I don't think that he ceased telling us kind of what was going on up into 1999 with the Ninth Gate. And so in ways, it's kind of a version of Dante's Inferno, where the lead character, Philip, I think it's Philip Corso or something like that, the Johnny Depp character is a book dealer who's led down into the underworld. And he meets various characters who are seeking satanic or Luciferian power. And without giving too much away, he discovers it in a way that neither he nor anyone else expects.
You mentioned Polanski's Rosemary's Baby. Mm-hmm. That was a powerful film. I've seen that several times. That was really creepy.
It is pretty creepy. I had, in fact, we did an episode of Hollywood Decoded, my TV show, on it. And I think they cut that one, which kind of sucks because I think it would have been a really, really cool episode, but it never made it to airing. So, and I think they cut it because they decided it was too dark for Gaia's streaming network. So, whatever. But it is a creepy film. I think in ways, if you go back and watch it now, it's kind of silly, it's kind of cheesy, but there still is a creepy element to it, especially when, you look at the Dakota building where it's filmed, and the weird history of the Dakota building with the assassination of John Lennon and other weird films that have been filmed there. If you watch Vanilla Sky, I don't think it's accidental that they put Tom Cruise's kind of fancy condo in the Dakota building, which is a weird element. I haven't really gotten to Vanilla Sky yet, but it definitely deserves some analysis. And then, of course, you have the overtly, satanic element of trying to bring in the satanic aeon with the impregnation of the Mia Farrow character. But I think we can't forget the other element that a lot of people forget, which is that her husband, who's in on it, his whole reasoning for all of this is because he wants to make it in Hollywood. So he wants to be a famous actor in Hollywood. And part of his reason for going along with this is that the Satanists in Hollywood can hook him up if he goes along with, with their plan for Rosemary.
What I thought was very interesting and original about Rosemary's Baby was the portrayal of the Satanists. They were almost comical and sort of pedestrian.
Right.
Which was a real kind of an interesting twist. Some
that
people,
is good.
A couple that could actually blend in with the general population and you would never suspect a thing.
That is an interesting point. Yeah, most of the time you kind of had this cartoonish, silly portrayal. And if I recall, I think Anton LaVey was the consultant and is who's wearing the Beast costume in the scenes with Rosemary. So in the bed. So yeah, I think that probably in the mind of LaVey, who was also a very cartoonish character, he would wear satanic costumes and whatnot, look like something from a B movie. But maybe at the same time, he was also consulting that look, Satanism can also take on a very subtle, mundane appearance as well.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that LaVey was associated with that film.
I think that's correct.
I had no idea about that. While we're on the subject of Roman Polanski, in my view, he's such an excellent, excellent director. And one of the greatest movies ever made, in my opinion, is Chinatown.
Chinatown. Yeah.
And he directed that.
Yeah, we actually, surprisingly, the Hollywood Decoded episode that did make it through from Polanski was the Chinatown episode. So I'm very proud of myself and Jay Widener in terms of the episode that we filmed about Chinatown, which, if you're not aware, I have a TV show with filmmaker Jay Widener on the Gaia TV network, which you can watch on Amazon Prime or through Gaia or whatever. But we did, I think, 20 something episodes, 19, 20 episodes, of film analysis, very similar to what's in the book. And one of the episodes was Polanski's Chinatown. And I think, once again, whatever you think of Polanski, we do have an insight into the power structure, because there it's the Los Angeles power structure, William Holland, and kind of a commentary on how Los Angeles I think it's in the 20s, if I recall, came to be through corporate subterfuge, through the privatization of water, and also just a very crazy, wild story, which is loosely based in reality. That's not exactly true, but there are some weird parallels as well with the fact that William Holland is played by John Huston, or the guy who stands in for William Mulholland, who and John Huston, the actor director, was, according to Steve Hodel, the son of George Hodel, the famed suspect in the Black Dahlia ritual killings. It's actually John Huston was in the circles, very close friends with George Hodel, and supposedly participated in the sort of ritual orgies and satanic celebrations that George Hodel was involved in. So, again, what is Polanski telling us here?
So who is making these claims about John Huston?
Well, it's in two different books. If you read the Dave McGowan's book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, there's an extensive discussion about the likely thesis that George Hodel was the Black Dahlia, or one of the Black Dahlia murderers, along with Man Ray. And I don't think that the accusation is that John Huston was a murderer per se, but that he was a participant in their parties. And that also is corroborated in Steve Hodel's book, Black Dahlia Avenger, which is the central argument that he's I think a police detective or something, but he's saying that it was my dad. My dad was the Black Dahlia killer, or him and other people, like surrealist artist Man Ray.
But anyway, certain people think that this is true and are making these claims. Okay.
Right. No, this is not my accusation. This is in Dave McGowan's book, and it's in Steve Hodel's book, Black Dahlia Avenger.
I'm speaking with author and radio and television host Jay Dyer. Today's show, Foreshadowing Ritual and Symbology in Film. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. Getting back to Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, what is the symbolism of the pillars in the film? For example, you have a picture in your book, Esoteric Hollywood, that in the beginning, Nicole Kidman is standing between pillars.
Mm-hmm. Well, admittedly, this is a little bit of kind of a loose interpretation on my part, but we do know from Kubrick's films and his commentaries that he was very attentive to detail and very, very meticulous about what images and symbols appeared in the films. So there's no question about that. And he was, again, a freak for detail and continuity. So I don't think the scenes are shot accidentally or just because they look good. I think they do have a significance. And I think that the opening sequence with the two pillars could suggest, the ideas of masonry, the idea of the lodge with the two pillars, Jachin and Boaz, which derives ultimately from Solomon's temple in the Old Testament. Or that's how the Freemasonic lodges adopt the two pillars in their system. And it's really kind of it has a multiple layer aspect to it, to where it's interpreted to be different things. Sometimes it's day and night. Sometimes it's, dialectical tensions between good and evil. Sometimes it's just male versus female. Again, it's just really suggesting duality. Two sides of the Kabbalah, for example, the two pillars, the two mercy and severity sides of the Kabbalistic tree. Albert Pike says that this is all what Masonry is based on. So I think that perhaps Kubrick is suggesting that. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that, for example, 2001 is based on Kabbalistic ideas and imagery. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Kubrick is including that in Eyes Wide Shut as well. So the idea of Nicole Kidman sort of being half naked there, and then The idea here is that you're looking into the secrets of how the occult elite or the social engineers, how they rule us, is in many ways through controlling our sexual desires, through the libido. That's a Freudian theme, at least, and there's no doubt that there's Freudian elements throughout Kubrick films, absolutely. And so I think perhaps what he might be saying is that, you in a way, you're peering into what you think is the sex lives of other people. There's kind of a meta fourth wall level analysis that's broken here with the fact that at the time Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman actually were married, and the paparazzi were always talking about their sex lives and crazy stuff like that. So there's that element to it. There's a lot of different layers going on here, but the fact that we're looking through the two pillars and to see the bare naked woman, the A-list star or something, I think this suggests that Kubrick is saying you are a sort of a porn obsessed society. You're controlled by this libido desire, and you don't even realize it.
And also the setting, the time of year, the season where Eyes Wide Shut takes place is Christmas. Mm-hmm. What is the significance of that, do you think?
That's a good question. I'm still not 100% positive that I have that figured out, but it could be Kubrick is playing on the idea of the commercialization of Christmas, that this is another aspect to how we are controlled through consumerism. This idea that the whole holiday is supposed to be about giving of gifts and self-sacrifice and that kind of stuff, giving, and it's all been inverted to be about consuming, about think about the lines of people that stand outside of to get the latest plastic thing from China or whatever. It's a never-ending kind of consumer black hole. That's what Christmas represents, and it also could be that he's saying that that from the perspective of the social engineers, it's an attempt to invert the message of Christmas, because a lot of satanic imagery is, of course, based on inversion. You invert the thing to give it its dark power.
Well, yes, that's it's sort of a jarring to watch that movie with all the Christmas lights and the Christmas mm-hmm. parties and the decorations, and yet at the same time, the film's message is so dark.
It is very dark. Is it perhaps talking about, pre-Christian times of solstice and that kind of stuff? Could be.
Right. Now, in Eyes Wide Shut, there are many mirrors. You point this out in your book. Are mirrors symbolic? And if so, what are they symbolic of?
They are, yeah. I mean, this is kind of a prevalent symbol in literature. There's no doubt about that. And most of the time it refers to the self or the soul or the psyche, and self-reflection, actualization, perhaps, depending upon what context it's used. But I would say that in the context of Eyes Wide Shut, one of the layers of the film is about the individual's realization of what he really is and what he really represents. So, for example, the beginning scene, when they're having an argument about sexuality within marriage and attraction, Nicole Kidman actually catches Tom Cruise in a lie. She says, "Were you tempted or attracted by the two girls that hit on you at the party?" And he's like, "Oh no, I would never." And she's like, "You've never been attracted to another woman." And Tom Cruise insists that he hasn't, and he's lying to himself. And she knows that he's lying, and he knows that he's lying. So there's another element that a lot of people miss throughout the film when you get focused on the esoteric stuff, which is about self-reflection and about realizing how we all wear masks. That's another theme throughout the film that's kind of, I would say, grounded in the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre, which, Sartre said that we're all kind of wearing masks and we're not admitting that our true authentic selves, right? That's a part of this film too that people overlook.
Yeah, you talk about that. Actually, you have some photographs from Eyes Wide Shut in your book where there are masks on the walls of the different interior scenes in the movie.
Yeah, the whore, Domino, when Tom Cruise visits her apartment, when he's, when he comes really close to cheating, he doesn't do it, but he comes close with the prostitute, and we see the masks everywhere. And so it's very, this prostitute has a line of books dealing with the sociology and psychology, which is, I would say, a little bit out of place for the average prostitute. And in my view, that suggests that she was actually part of the ritual. So it would appear that throughout the story, and this is my thesis on the film, it would appear that the characters that Tom Cruise keeps sort of interacting with and by chance meeting, it's not by chance. He's actually being led to the ritual.
Is human sacrifice a theme in Eyes Wide Shut?
It is, because the beauty queen, whom Tom Cruise's character had earlier sort of checked on and helped through an overdose. At the beginning of the film, she has overdosed in the upstairs apartment, cheating with Ziegler at the party. She later sees him and realizes that he's come to the ritual. My theory is that he was brought to the ritual on purpose. The whole thing was kind of organized. But she has said the whole time that she wants out of it. She's a drug addict because she doesn't want to be in this cult, but there's no way out of this cult. And so whatever sort of strange laws or rules this cult has, she has to offer herself as his redemption. And she does, because, she wants out in the most extreme sense. Like, she's willing to die. She's already been, trying to overdose. And so she says, well, I'll just give it up and, he can have my place or whatever. So that's my theory on this. This is a class of elite. There's a strict class system. This is part of it as well. Kubrick is a pretty constant critic of the class system, going all the way back to Spartacus. Kubrick is saying that you're not going to reach a certain level no matter who you are. Right. I mean, in other words, you can, if you're Tom Cruise and you're upper middle class, lower bourgeois, whatever, you're not ever going to be in this class of people. And that's what Tom Cruise can't fathom. Or he's being inducted into the cult. That's kind of one of the debatable topics in the end of the film.
Why do you think Stanley Kubrick's final movie, Eyes Wide Shut, is important?
Because it shows us what really goes on. As I said earlier, we have been exposed to this kind of ritual abuse in the Roman Catholic Church, this kind of pederasty in other situations like Penn State, Jimmy Savile. And if you think back to the Dutroux affair in Belgium and the elite of Belgium that were involved in that, I think Kubrick's giving us a window into what really goes on. That's why it matters.
Can you discuss some of the movies that included foreshadowing of 9/11?
Yeah, there are a bunch of those. And one of the clearest ones is The Matrix. You have Neo's information file that Agent Smith has on him. This, of course, takes place in the future. Neo's date of birth is 9/11/2001. And that's, I think, a curious thing to just randomly stick in there, especially given the fact that the second Matrix film includes, now the Matrix came out in 1998 or 9, but the second Matrix film includes a giant terror attack on a building that is, controlled demolition. So there's some weird stuff in there. Other films are a little clearer than this, I would say, like the pilot of the Lone Gunman series, which is the X-Files spinoff. The pilot aired, I think, 6 months or so before the events of 9/11, and you have radio hijacked airlines that are attempting to be flown into the World Trade Towers by a rogue shadow group within the U.S. government. Again, I think that's very clearly hinting at something. We also have a lot of films that were preparing us for the idea of the large-scale Arab terror attack. The first of these that's a blockbuster is True Lies. The James Cameron.
Was that an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie?
It is.
I saw that. That was upsetting.
It's the first blockbuster Arab terror villain attack film. Now, I'm not saying that means that James Cameron, or I think it was James Cameron, but I'm not saying that means that he was secretly involved in it. It doesn't have to be like that. I mean, what can happen is you'll get consulting. Like if you want to use aircraft carriers or military equipment. There's a great book on this about the Pentagon and the CIA in Hollywood. David Robb, his book on this, describes how the usage of the military equipment requires that you kind of go along with certain narratives that the Pentagon might want. Like, we want you to portray the military good in your film, and then you can use our tanks and helicopters or whatever in the background. Or it might be something like, if you want to use our equipment, we'd like to go ahead and start maybe easing up the American population to the idea of the Arab terror attack. We think that the Arab terrorists are coming to get us. So this would begin to be put into films. Another film that not just me, but actually Professor Elliot Gaines, who's a professor at something like University of Iowa, maybe. Anyway, he wrote an essay a long time ago that's since been, I think, published into a book about symbology in film and pop culture. And he also noticed a long time ago that the imagery and symbolism of Independence Day, which came out prior to 9/11, is chock full of imagery kind of preparing the public for large-scale terror events, and specifically the demolition of big-scale buildings in New York by this, quote, alien threat. And again, if you think, well, yeah, but it's aliens, it's not Arab terrorists. Well, actually, if you go back to the Cold War, you can study how the military was using the alien phenomena in science fiction as part of psychological warfare. Because in the mind of the average viewer, when they're watching, for example, The Twilight Zone, and you're seeing all these alien threats against the U.S. military, the reason that The Twilight Zone quite literally had Department of Defense consultation was that it was seen to be part of the Cold War. Because the human mind associates any external threat as an external threat. It doesn't matter whether it's in fiction, it's aliens, and then the news tells you it's the commies or the Arab terrorists. That's the way psychological warfare works. That they know that the subconscious will associate the two. So you can actually use fictional aliens as a staged fake threat to control the population.
I'm speaking with author and radio and television host Jay Dyer. Today's show, Foreshadowing Ritual and Symbology in Film. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. Now, we're talking about examples of predictive programming in movies. There's also television. Now, you mentioned The Lone Gunman. I saw that. Mm-hmm. That was just an incredible example, right down to who the perpetrators were.
I don't doubt that there's absolutely 100% CIA connection between these groups, and that's how the message is put into fiction. In fact, Dean Haglund from the X-Files and The Lone Gunman has given interviews where he said that when we were on the set of X-Men, we would have CIA consultants telling us what they would like to see in the episodes. On set. So you think, what? That's crazy. No, just go look up Chase Brandon, look up Milt Bearden. They are famous CIA liaisons and consultants for countless films. Everything from Meet the Fockers, if you've seen the Ben Stiller comedy. Either Chase Brandon or Milt Bearden consulted on that. The Recruit with Al Pacino and Ryan Felipe. That was a CIA-made film. Kathleen Kennedy and her Zero Dark 30. I mean, these are all quite literally CIA movies.
Right. I was about to ask you, what are some of the movies and TV shows influenced by the military and the CIA?
There's thousands of them.
Yeah. And why do you think they have such a strong and broad influence on Hollywood?
Well, because Edward Bernays said Hollywood is the most powerful engine of propaganda the world has ever known. So if you are a military, Pentagon, CIA person, you want to influence culture. You want to influence minds. You want to do the basic kind of stuff that Sun Tzu talked about, making sure that people do what you want them to do. So what better way than conditioning them through fiction? How many people are going to see James Bond as opposed to, reading some World War II history book.
Exactly. Can you describe some of the ways the cartoon show G.I. Joe revealed certain military technologies we have today?
Yeah, this is a very striking and kind of one of the most amazing aspects of the whole thing, believe it or not, was because I grew up with G.I. Joe in the 80s. I was a kid of the 80s, and every kid who grew up in the 80s, played with G.I. Joe. And so one of the first tier level one conspiracy things that you learn about this is that that's military conditioning, right? And that's not too far fetched when you start to think about, well, yeah, I guess that does make sense why G.I. Joe was introduced to, give the idea of join Uncle Sam in the fight against all the bad guys. That makes sense. But why is that crazy? Well, it gets a lot deeper than that, because in the narrative of G.I. Joe, the cartoon series in the 80s, I mean, you actually have episodes that are dealing, for example, explicitly with the Federal Reserve, of all things, and how the fiat money isn't real. And there's actually an episode where Cobra institutes Cobra currency, and he goes into this rant about how the Federal Reserve is fiat money; it's not real, and Cobra currency will be backed by gold because gold is, the true standard for how currency should be backed. I remember when the first time I saw that years ago, I was like, well, that's kind of weird. Why would that be in G.I. Joe? And then I started rewatching the G.I. Joe cartoon episodes, and I started noticing consistently, oh, well, here's one episode that's about Skynet and the creation of global surveillance. Okay, well, that's kind of a science fiction thing. I don't guess that's too real. Well, then another episode, we start seeing geoengineering weather modification. I'm thinking, well, that's a little bit stranger. Why would that be in G.I. Joe? And then the next episode you're watching, and it's about quite literally MK Ultra. They're referencing the military studying mind control. Now, of course, most of the time in the G.I. Joe cartoons, it's Cobra. It's the bad guys that are doing it. But in some cases, there's even episodes where the good guys and the bad guys have to link up. For example, Cobra is a terrorist organization in the narrative of G.I. Joe. But there are some episodes where G.I. Joe has to link up with Cobra to fight a common enemy. And I'm thinking, well, that's very bizarre, because didn't the military have to supposedly link up with the jihadis, right, to fight the Soviets? That was the American narrative, even into the 80s. In fact, the I think it's Living Daylights, the episode, the Bond film in the 80s, 87, I think, with Timothy Dalton. In that film, Timothy Dalton teams up with quite literally a bin Laden character and the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets. So even into the 80s, where they were still promoting the narrative of the jihad and the Mujahideen as the freedom fighters, the good guys. And even in G.I. Joe, at times, the terrorists are our allies. So it gets crazier and you can keep going with nanotechnology, and all this really far out future tech was placed into the 80s G.I. Joe series.
How has the subject of mind control been portrayed in movies?
Well, that's a very big question, a very deep question. When Hollywood began to consciously work with, the narrative of something like Manchurian Candidate. If you've seen the Manchurian Candidate, you kind of get the presentation that the Soviets are up to this, and the commies are going to brainwash all of our POWs and all that. And actually, Walter Boer, in his great book Operation Mind Control, he makes a very powerful argument that that was itself kind of a psyop. That what the American military was doing was trying to have a justification for their own large-scale psychological testing and mind control experiments, known generally as MK Ultra, under the guise of saying, "Well, the commies are going to do this to us," right?
Well, you brought up the Manchurian Candidate, the original one, which is one of my favorite movies. That's an incredibly good movie.
Yeah, it is a good movie.
Oh, unbelievable, starring Angela Lansbury. And that came out right before the Kennedy assassination, didn't it? It
Exactly.
Sort of prefigured that whole thing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think we did a long time ago, we did an article or a video, I can't remember, it's been several years where we discussed just that very thing, the similarities between what you're talking about and JFK. There's also, if you think of the Gene Hackman film, The Conversation, which is a very, that's a very well done surveillance film where he kind of goes crazy. That actually came out right before the Watergate stuff, and other people have noticed the strange parallels to the Watergate surveillance and Conversation. So the predictive programming aspect of things appearing in fiction before they appear in so-called mainstream reality, it goes back a long way. It doesn't. It's not something that started in the '90s or 2000s. I'm all the time finding examples like this, and yes, it's absolutely similar when it comes to assassination attempts. There's another great example of this that kind of harkens to JFK and maybe to other assassinations or attempted assassinations in the Warren Beatty movie. The Warren Beatty movie.
The Parallax View?
The Parallax View, yeah. Thank you.
Yes. I always get mixed up about that movie, and I've seen it twice, but I can never remember the narrative of the thing.
Well, he is a reporter who goes into investigating this company, this shadow private entity that appears to be recruiting psychopaths, people with murderous and sort of psychopathic tendencies, and he's very curious as to what is the purpose of all this, and so he ends up applying to go through this company's program. It turns out it's a giant mind control program, and they're wiping people's brains, and they are looking for the perfect patsy. And of course, it turns out Warren Beatty fits the profile of the perfect patsy. So, spoiler alert, I'd kind of give it away, but it relates to the assassination of I think a populist politician or something to that effect. So, so there's definitely some meat there in ways similar to kind of a Clockwork Orange, another Kubrick film where Kubrick is telling us about the Tavistock style brainwashing attempts to condition the public and the masses to have no virility, no drive, no desire for change, to just be passive and apathetic. That's essentially what they do with the hoodlum character Alex in the film. They turn him into a docile sort of zombie.
And finally, could you describe what happened to your WordPress account?
I'd been with WordPress, I think, for 9 or 10 years, and they had a very strong reputation for free speech. My blog didn't include anything significantly dangerous or violent. Never called for violence. No affiliation with any fringe radical groups or anything like that. So there wasn't really any cause for removal or in terms of violation of their terms of service, but basically the site was just removed one day. So they give you 7 days to export your site to some other place. And after a long time, I did finally get an email from WordPress explaining what it was, and the email had no substantive explanation. It said basically the same thing that I was told when it was taken down, which was that your site violates our terms of service. So no example. I was never told what violated terms of service. I mean, I've been there for 10 years. I was not just a free customer. I was a long time paying customer with the premium platform, but none of that got me anywhere. So I was removed at the same time as a lot of alternative journalist media sites were removed the same day.
Jay Dyer, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.